this video, we're going to continue exploring the idea of cultural context. And we're going to take the example of Ballad of Birmingham, a poem that you've worked with already in the term, and think a little bit more specifically about the historical cultural context and how we can find out some good information about that that will help our analysis of the poem. First, let's talk for a minute about the idea of framing. We've already examined the notion of cultural discourses. We've talked about dominant and subversive and competing discourses. Framing is examining the details of how information is presented to determine how a topic is positioned in the overall cultural discourse. So when you are having that discussion about a certain topic that constitutes basically a cultural discourse, it matters how that information is presented. In what way is it packaged? What are the other things that are appearing around it? For example, if we're talking about like a newspaper or a clip in a news show, how is that being contextualized? And in what ways does that affect our ability to analyze the cultural discourse? So framing intersects with all of the discourse types that we've talked about. And differences in framing are informed by different biases. And when I say bias there, I don't mean that in an inherently negative way. Simply, I mean that as people from different points of view and with different life experiences are going to necessarily have a different way of looking at things. Let's remind ourselves about the Ballad of Birmingham. That was the poem that was the dialogue between the mother and the daughter about whether or not the daughter could go to the Freedom March. And it was about a specific event, the bombing of the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, Alabama, that happened on September 15th, 1963. So it was basically a fictional representation of a conversation between this mother and daughter, imagined as being the morning of this terrible bombing that took place in 1963. We definitely can do some historical research about that and find out some information. But what we really want to get at here is, how was this event being talked about in the period? So if we do just a little bit of random Googling, we may find a secondary source that can give us some helpful background information and maybe some clues in terms of where to continue looking to find more specific information from the period. So we may find something like this.
Finally, the connection. Tonight, a few lives remembered from the Civil Rights era. They would have been in their early 60s now, grandmothers perhaps, maybe nearing the end of their careers or enjoying retirement. Instead, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Wesley were killed 50 years ago today in one of the worst acts of violence during the Civil Rights Movement. They died on a Sunday morning when the church they attended, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, was bombed. This recollection is from a new documentary called Preserving Justice.
My teacher, Miss Wesley, her daughter was one of the ones who was killed in that church bombing, Cynthia Wesley. And I can remember seeing her sitting on the stoop outside the emergency room crying.
This man survived those very dangerous times, even though he was a civil rights attorney who worked with Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His name was Demetrius Newton, and he was interviewed for the same documentary.
I saw two white police officers manhandle a young black girl that I knew. And I think it was the catalyst that perhaps led me to choose a career.
Later, Newton became the first African-American to serve as president pro tem of the Alabama House. He died at the age of 85 earlier this week. 50 years after that church bombing, he was fondly remembered by both black and white Alabamans. And those four girls who lived such terribly short lives were remembered throughout Birmingham. This morning, bells tolled at 10:22, the time the bomb exploded, and the Sunday school lesson that was interrupted that day was read from start to finish.
So that gives us a lot of good information and context. It doesn't quite get us what we're after, though, which is to examine the discourse of the period. How was this event being talked about at the time? So what we really need for that is to find some contemporary sources that we can look at, sources that were written, produced at the same time as this. That's our first step, to find those original details. And we have a lot of information in this case. We've got the date, we've got names of the girls, we have all sorts of good things that we can use. Second, we want to look for sources, ideally primary historical sources. So in other words, like I was saying, things from that time period. The resource we're going to use is a Library of Congress website called Chronicling America. And it's basically a site that has scanned versions of newspapers from the past, from all 50 states, just millions of pages of data. And hopefully we can find some contemporary accounts of this bombing. We're going to look for multiple sources to determine the state of the cultural discourse. So by looking at a little sampling, hopefully we'll be able to get at whether there was a single dominant idea, a competing discourse, there was a lot of subversive commentary going on. We want to find that out. And then finally, we're going to analyze the samples that we find. So let me show you this website. Here we get a sense of what this site contains. So there are all the digitized newspapers, and notice they go from 1789 to 1963. We're really fortunate that it goes right up to the year that we need. Also, we can select by state. Now in our case, because we want to see the sort of broad general sense of the discourse, we're not going to do that. We're not going to restrict it just to certain states. But we definitely should restrict it by year, because we do know what year we're looking for. And so that will help us out in terms of limiting our source so we're not getting too many hits that make it hard to deal with. So we're going to just look at the year 1963, because that's when this happened. And then let's try Birmingham bombing. And we do indeed get a bunch of different stories in a bunch of different papers from all over the country. It would be a good idea to look at some different ones from different parts of the country, for example. So we're going to look at the Arizona Tribune, the Detroit Tribune. I thought that would be of interest since we live near Detroit here. We're going to look at the Chronicle from Mississippi, so that's a nearby state. And we're going to take a look at the Jackson Advocate from Mississippi. And this is actually an African-American newspaper, like a newspaper targeted to the African-American community. So that's a little bit of a different and interesting example. So that's just a few. Obviously, if you wanted to get an even better sense, you would look at even more. But for the purpose of the short video, we're going to look at these few examples to talk about framing. Here are the sources that I just mentioned. One thing we can do is even just in this view, take a look at the different ways in which things are positioned on the page. Where does that story come up? So you can't quite see it here, but the headline about the bombing is right here on the Arizona Tribune. Look at the headline that's running in the Detroit Tribune, Ask National Mourning Day for Bomb Victims. So that's talking about a specific thing that's happening here, the idea of asking for a National Day of Mourning. So it's interesting that that's the thing that is in the headline that's being used as the hook for the story. This one is up here in the corner, and you see this political cartoon kind of dominates this page, and this is actually an editorial page. So news reporting versus editorial, that's going to be really important. And this one is an editorial page as well, and the story or the commentary about the bombing is occurring right here in the column. Let's look a little bit more closely at some of the framing here. Okay, so let's take a look at one of these examples in more detail. We'll start with the Arizona Chronicle. So these are some excerpts blown up of that page. So here you can see the story itself, Federal Query in Birmingham Bombing. So that's a pretty neutral way of talking about it, right? It's just reporting on what's happening, that there's going to be a federal inquiry into the bombing. That's definitely news. You can understand why that's leading in the headline. Now look what this story is being contextualized with, right? So we've got some images of African Americans that seem pretty positive, right? You've got a black person and a white person working on something together. If we wanted to even get in more detail, just choosing an image where the African American person is sort of standing over and almost looking like in a supervisory role, that's a really interesting choice there. And the idea on the one on the right with people smiling, shaking hands. So I'm not trying to suggest that we can know for sure what's in people's minds as they're choosing images. What I'm saying is the effect of these images is positive, right? That it's suggesting a positive representation of African American people. And that is important in terms of how that's surrounding the story about the bombing. It gives you a sense of how that's being, as we talked about, framed. The story here about the NAACP working against rights bill foes. So it's contextualizing the bombing with a story, like immediately after that is a story about the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, which was in process at this time in 1963. And then even here, talking about someone being named as a vice prexy of the Shenley division. I mean, that doesn't mean anything to us, but the idea is that it's talking about an African American being named to a position of responsibility. So all of these stories that are on the page in this case suggest a very positive view of the civil rights movement, and suggests therefore that this bombing would be considered a sort of horrendous thing, and that it's thinking through the bombing by putting it right there together with some of these other things about civil rights. It's thinking through that bombing not just as, you know, a tragic act that killed some people, but as an act of terror in an ongoing civil conflict between those who want civil rights for all and those who want to retain the ideology of segregation. So that's pretty clear from how that's being positioned and what else it's being contextualized with. Okay, so let's take a look at this one that was the editorial page in the Mississippi paper. Take a look at the title there, Birmingham Bombing Will Help Chance of Civil Rights Measure. That sounds like a pretty positive headline, that it's saying that because of the bombing, the civil rights bill is going to have a better chance of passing. It also has some of the same logic as the Arizona paper in the sense that it is connecting those two things. It is not, again, viewing the bombing as a sort of isolated incident that is apart from the civil rights movement, but saying that this bombing is connected to what's going on in the broader picture of civil rights. So that's emerging as a dominant way of thinking about that bombing from the discourse that we're looking at in these different papers. Now let's actually take a look at the text and think about the content of how it's being talked about here. So in this one, this is a straight news story, right? And so it's reporting on the facts, talks about the grand jury being ordered to investigate racial disturbances in Birmingham, right? So not just the bombing, but there's a broader investigation going on here. And then it talks about the specific bombing, killing the 4 girls, injuring 23 others, and that would be a point of emphasis. Then it moves to a paragraph about President Kennedy being outraged over the incident and gives a not exactly a direct quote, but the sense of something that he said, that he hoped the tragedy would awaken the nation to the folly of racial injustice, hatred, and violence. And then it gives some more facts. So even though it's just a short news story reporting on the facts that are selected are important. And by emphasizing that quotation from President Kennedy, that's suggesting a way of looking at that bombing and seeing it as, in this case, a wake-up call to really do something about racial injustice. This one's coming from the Detroit paper. And it also starts with President Kennedy and commenting on his indignation and that he is announcing setting aside a national day of mourning because of the bombing. And then it's sort of interspersed with these paragraphs in bold that talk about the news of what's actually going on. Talks about the funeral, talks about people marching from the church to the White House in Washington on Sunday. So that's what's in the bold paragraphs. And then the rest of this is talking about Congress asking for this National Day of Mourning. It gives some quotations, for example, from the senator from Minnesota, says that he denounced what he termed the, quote, Southern establishment of business and professional leaders who have invited, yes, incited racial violence for economic profit. And then that last paragraph that I have included in this excerpt here, again, it's giving a quotation from the same senator from before, and it talks about how Southern tensions also must be shared by Northern leaders who have at the very least acquiesced in the policies of racial degradation and humiliation. So in this one, it's making a larger point about racial inequality in the country and saying this isn't just a Southern problem. And that makes sense because this is a Detroit paper, right? So this is thinking through a broader view of what's going on and thinking about it not just regionally in terms of what's happening in the South, but suggesting how this might affect the North as well. So we can see why this paper may be covering this in this way. It seems to fit in with what we're seeing so far in terms of connecting this bombing to the broader idea of civil rights, and in fact positioning this bombing as the latest and most powerful reason that civil rights need to be granted. All right, and now let's take a look at this one that had the political cartoons for a second. So we talked about how the title actually seemed to be fairly positive that the bombing will help chance of the civil rights measure. Let's take a look at the content of this one now a little bit. The darkness which is falling on Alabama is falling elsewhere too, and nowhere more somberly than over the decent Southern cause in the United States Senate. Now, we might have to do a little more research on what Southern cause meant in this period, but I'll just tell you for the sake of convenience here. Southern cause was the sort of coded language for let's keep segregation, let's keep separate but equal. Okay, so as it turns out, even though the headline seems positive, we're seeing as we get into the content that this actually may be a different view about the bombing than maybe what we've seen in the straight news stories that we've just looked at. And remember, this one's an editorial. This is coming from an editorial page in a Mississippi paper. And so it's giving us a bit of a different view. All right, to continue on. This cause is to resist, not merely in behalf of the South, but in behalf of ordered freedom everywhere. Those extremist aspects of an administration civil rights program of federal force, which the president himself long refused to request, but now demands. Not long ago, the clear prospect was that he would, that is the president, would at length be granted some, but not all of that program, that is the civil rights program. For it has unwisdom as well as wisdom in it. The outlook was that while measures would be taken to vindicate actual Negro rights, and just reading the quote, obviously we don't use that terminology anymore, notably the vote, the president would be denied, for illustration, federal sanctions to end discrimination even on private property and as a matter of private choice. Today, no man can say how far Congress may go, lashed by the emotional storms that blow in from outrages in Alabama. What could have been a grave and memorably sensible dialogue on this issue has been so embittered as to leave the moderate inside and outside the South all but defenseless in the storm. So the argument that is emerging here is that segregation should be more of a debatable issue, that there could be some good reasons, for example, people's private choice to not serve Black people. And I think there's echoes in the discourse we have today about whether or not individuals can choose to serve gay people, for example. But that's how this was being discussed in this editorial, that maybe that's something that could be debated. And it's suggesting that now, because of the bombing, because that was so horrific, it's going to allow a much more, in this writer's view, radical version of the Civil Rights Bill to pass. And that's the fear of this writer, that the Civil Rights Bill will go too far and give the federal government too much power to enact the racial equality that many people were calling for. So that's pretty interesting. So in terms of our analysis, after looking at some of those things, what we're realizing here is that in 1963 America, ideas about racial justice were the subject of a volatile competing discourse. There were lots of sort of nuances. It wasn't just as easy as equality versus segregation. In fact, that discourse, it looked a lot more like sort of discourse around gay rights today, and maybe even once again discourse about racial justice today, that some of these discourses are being recycled in our own time. So it's especially important to sort of learn about where they come from and what shape they took even back then in 1963. But at any rate, it certainly was a competing discourse. There were people on both sides of this question. The bombing itself, though, everyone agrees was wrong. It was over the top. It was horrific. It was an act of terrorism, and it definitely was race violence, right? So it was violence inspired by people hating Black people. That is clear. And even people who were pro-segregationists, like that last article that we looked at, agree that the bombing was just over the top and a terrible thing. So the reaction to that bombing is complex. Those who favor segregation admit it was wrong, but use various arguments to maintain that segregation is still okay in some ways, right? That it's still a debate that we should have and we should talk about it, and you don't want it to go too far with this civil rights bill and things like that. And those who favor equality can point to the bombing as a really excellent example of why things have got to change in this country. That gives us a sense of what the cultural discourse, the landscape of the cultural discourse looked like at the time of this bombing. And now, with that in mind, go back and reread that poem, and it's going to give you a lot more sense of the significance of the discourse in the poem about what was a very contentious issue in 1963 America.